Good afternoon. We want to welcome you to TFA Fine Arts for this conversation with Tanner Goldbeck and Peter Frank. We are so excited to have Tanner's dynamic work at the gallery. He brings street art, comic art, and fine arts together and just creates these amazing, amazing dynamic pieces. And Peter Frank, of course, is renowned, very well-known art critic, writer, scholar, curator, and we're thrilled to have him to have this conversation with Tanner. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Tanner came to this gallery in an exhibition I organized with Caroline called That Layered Look, bringing together various artists, mostly from in the Southern California area, who worked with some form of layering in their processes, in their compositions, in their structures. And that fit Tanner to a T. So I introduced him and his work to Caroline, who was absolutely thrilled with it. And so thrilled that obviously she went and gave him a one-person show, amidst which we now sit. And one of the great things about Tanner's work is it poses very, very direct questions and answers questions very directly. There's and it's at the same time brings together issues of fine art with issues of sociological import. That is, it's fine art as opposed to, or as integrated into street art. So the question that Tanner probably gets asked most often is, was he still a tagger? So does he still do graffiti? Or did he ever? Are you now, or have you ever been a tagger?
I've never been a tagger. My graffiti experience is limited, but I've been around it for years. I grew up in the country. I grew up in Baltimore. We grew up in the woods, so we didn't have street walls and we didn't have sidewalks. So we didn't really do a lot of tagging, but I grew up really interested in the art. It wasn't until I moved to Los Angeles that I really got to meet, really well-established people.
But you saw graffiti in Baltimore.
Yeah, we did. I didn't really know much about it, but I saw it and instantly, even as a kid, was really interested in that kind of stuff. Really bright colors, crazy designs. The streetcar photos from, the 70s in New York, all of that kind of stuff was really cool. So I didn't know it at the time growing up how I was going to end up here, but looking back, I can see the kind of things that I was interested in, and I can see it now, and I can make, connections to these things. But at the time, I was really interested in comics. Everybody was. I kind of have this the analog and digital half of my life where, so about half of my life was analog. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have emails. We couldn't just Google anything. So you kind of had sort of a limited scope of the things you were exposed to. And it was comics, it was records, it was magazines. And that was.
So the graffiti style came to you rather than the graffiti itself, for the most part.
Yeah, I didn't have experience with people actually doing it and who were really good at it until I moved to LA. And that was, 20 years ago. So, but I was already kind of preset for jumping into it. And once I got to meet people who were good at it and who had exposure to it, I got a chance to do a few walls here and there, and it was pretty awesome. So,
well, one of the things that drew me to your work, as long as I've known it, is this kind of formal aesthetic respect and curiosity about what we're calling street art for as an overall term, graffiti and comics, etc. And I'm not talking ideologically about the collapse of Hollywood into one, although you can talk about that too. but how the value, the aesthetic values are finally at the bottom the same.
Yeah, it's interesting having like so the way I best describe it is I had two sets of doing things. Like one was more like illustration design, learning more for fundamental kind of art, and then the street art element was this wild kind of anything goes kind of situation. And I didn't really know how to blend the two together until much later, which is kind of what this show is, kind of a compilation of different mindsets. It's I can, as an artist, I can get addicted to basically any format. And you put me in front of something and give me half an hour, and I'll start getting addicted to it. But the energy of the street art versus the format of the I do right now. So,
Do you ever find energy, fine art, and formality in street art
yes, absolutely.
that you don't have to make yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. You do cross-reference all these things. Like I even through I went to the Maryland Institute of Art and graduated there, and at the time it was very.
Point out, for those who don't know, the Maryland Institute of Art, located in Baltimore.
Yes.
That's one of the finest art schools in the country.
I lucked out. It just happened to be like an hour away from where I grew up, so it was kind of like, yeah. And where I grew up out in the country, out in Baltimore County at the time, there were 3 kids who were into art and had one high school art teacher, and the high school art teacher was the one person that got me out of this universe. And he said, hey, if you want to, go to art school. And I didn't even know art school existed. And then down the street was the Maryland Institute of Art. So it was pretty amazing, the transition from knowing nothing into, art school. So yeah, it was, I often say, like, when I was in elementary school, I could mimic things. I was very good at mimicking things. Like if I could see something, I could draw something. So being the art kid, I didn't know anything about it, but I could do it. And then going to art school was just a mind-blowing experience. Like I had no idea what I was in for, but I was still kind of too young to really appreciate the fine art aspect of things, I think. So it's been a long road to get to this point. A good one.
It is. Well, graffiti has been aestheticized almost as long as it's been around in our contemporary context. You remember the show a few years ago at MoCA.
Oh yeah.
Dealt with the history of graffiti art and organized by somebody who was close into it. And some say that it's spawned a whole new generation of fine art graffitists.
Yeah, there were the art stars, I guess, and it even goes back to that again, that pre-digital analog era in New York, where you had this whole scene that was evolving, and it was a little bit before my time. But when the internet came into play, and then street art was becoming really popular. I know in LA it was already popular, and like you said, the museum kind of did the history of it, and all these people started mixing up and cross-referencing into, like, some of the guys became really big art stars in the fine art world. It did somehow, like, there's always been this division, and I think I'm a part of these people that kind of one foot on each side.
Right, exactly.
So
well, the people we know about, we think of are people who even thought of themselves as with one foot on each side.
Yeah.
Basquiat, obviously.
Yeah.
Keith Haring, Chaz Bajorquez is here.
Yeah.
These are people who always saw the art in the graffiti. They weren't told they were artists. They already knew. They weren't told to think like artists. They were already doing that.
Right, and you have to go where you go. If you're an artist, you're going to go there. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, Keith, in fact, was very rigid about it. He did not tag. He went into subways with his graffiti artist friends, but he did not tag with them. He went off to the side and drew his figures and his images, his symbols on advertisements that were displayed, and sometimes he papered them over, and creative work. In fact, we did a whole quasi gallery of that at the Broadway Lafayette station, subway station, right by Soho.
Yeah, that's looking back, like even when I was in school, even Maryland Institute of Art was much smaller than it is now, but it was very much geared towards being a fine art college. And it was, painting was in a certain scope. And when you even talked about comics or if you talked about street art, it was always kind of put in your head that that wasn't really art, and then, so that's where kind of the division for me, I like these things, but I didn't seriously consider them to be viable. And then, 30 years later, of course it is, but when people tell you from a very early age, well, that's not really art. You've got to be this painter over here. I think that took a long time for me to make peace with. But,
That's surprising to hear, given the sophistication of what you're doing now.
Well, it was all lining up to happen. I had for 20, 30 years, I had what I was doing for jobs like illustration and design, and I love the comic elements and the drawing, and I ended up going to the Joe Kubert School in New Jersey for comics. After graduating Maryland Institute, I still hadn't figured out what I was going to do, and it's this kind of funny little story. I was reading a comics magazine I was working at a t-shirt company, and it said, the Joe Kubert School in New Jersey, and it was all about drawing comics. And I still thought of it as kind of a job, but I thought, well, maybe this is a job I could do. So I went back to school and moved to New Jersey. And
you saw this as an ethnic comic.
Yeah, it was a wizard comic book, kind of a magazine about comics. And I was on a lunch break and saw this ad, and it was like 3 or 4 pages about the school. And I didn't tell anyone, but on my lunch break, I called the school and I got an interview. And from Baltimore, I drove up. I took a day off from work. I drove up to New Jersey for my interview.
Where in New Jersey?
Dover, New Jersey.
Okay.
So you're up pretty far. You're parallel with Manhattan, but you're like 40 minutes in. So I quit my job. I packed up my pickup truck and I moved to New Jersey. And it was like boot camp for drawing, but I still had this mindset that it was a job. But I spent, it was a total drawing figure boot camp the whole time. So I really was focused on getting employment. I didn't think of it as fine art. I still had this idea that fine art was painting and it was off in another direction. So yeah, it took me years to.
Well, in those days, who were you looking at? Both which fine art did you like looking at, and did you even talking, and which, for want of a better word, commercial art?
Yeah, there were a lot of comic book people. There's a guy named Bill Sienkiewicz, and I look at his work now, and it's very much more. I was really interested in.
What's he drawing?
Oh, he did. I blank out on some of them, but he's done comics forever. He's done all kinds of Marvel and DC.
He's a Marvel.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, but he's one of those guys that he's very distinctive when you see his work. Yeah, it's stunning. So, but there were illustrators that I really liked. The guy I was just thinking of the other day, J.C. Leindecker, and he was a very formal painter, but his technique was amazing.
That's turn of the last century.
But I was really interested in painting. I really wanted to learn how the mechanics of that was working. I hadn't thought of how I was going to use it, but I was influenced by another guy comes to mind, Bernie Wrightson. His drawing skills blew my mind. The details. I was really obsessed with the detail work.
Where were you looking at Leyendecker?
Bookstores. Yeah, bookstores.
Okay.
Going into Manhattan and going to bookstores and art books. I think there were, these annual publications of American illustrators, Norman Rockwell and all those guys. I kind of just went from name to name, and I think of myself as like, I'm not an expert in any one thing, but I know a lot about little things. So I have this wide range of different areas I jump around in all the time. But never mind.
My turn next.
Mm-hmm.
Do you quote any? Are there actual quotes in your work? There seem to be in certain works, like That seems to be that square one right there seems to have the face of that tiger.
Yeah. That is Prince John. Most of the work I do, all the line art from all of these pieces, is taken from my own work that I've done for commercial jobs, my illustration work.
Mm-hmm.
On occasion, I will use different characters, and I was in my anti-Trump mode for a while, and I used the character Prince John from the old Robin Hood animations from. And as a kid, I copied those characters, and Prince John was the false king that had the crown and was always, complaining and super vain. And anyway, I was in my little Trump phase. I made a little commentary with that character, and I kind of ground him up. And there's a painting in the back that's similar. Yeah. So sometimes I can make commentary, but it's pretty subtle.
And I assume, on the other hand, that the compositional process of any given work, which is a process,
Yes.
is something that's kind of intuitive on your part.
It is. I think talking about how I made the transition from still doing commercial work. I had been in a point where I was really looking to figure out how I was able to mimic a lot of different styles of different people, but I hadn't really thought how I was going to transition into something that was my own. And then one day it was like having a light bulb came on. Like, you have thousands of these drawings that you've done for all these commercial jobs. And I'd spent so many years fine tuning like the linear aspect of making these pieces of art, like the drawing and the inking. And it was such a big deal to me that I thought, why don't I just take some of these line art pieces and just chop them up and make something abstract out of it? And it was like a one-day thing. Like, oh, wow, I can. So I started taking these objects and pieces of these objects from work that I'd already done, and I could break them down and actually destroy the original intent of what it was, but still keep the characteristic of the line art and make completely new designs. So that was kind of, that was like the hello moment. We're like, okay, I can make this happen. And it just started from there. And the compositions, originally the black line was the structure. Mm-hmm. However, I abstracted that structure. And then the painterly aspect came in with all the textures and the layers, all the building up of that. And it kind of became this kind of control deal, spontaneity between like the structure of the line art and the craziness of the color. So It's a little battle that I have.
And it's kind of a big battle for viewers to not to discern what's a quotation from a commercial art or graffiti form or something like that, and what are fine considerations in terms of composition, brushstroke, that, and color choices. But how to keep them integrated and maintain the integrity of your compositions.
You have questions?
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may ask a question.
Sure.
There's some things that I see between, I'll just throw a couple of thoughts out there and I want to know what you guys think. There's James Rosenquist, some Rothko elements, Japanese, the line art, and even some odd things like archaeology, the layering of the paint, kind of like with the street art. And I remember looking at this Dennis Hopper Polaroids book where he's making this commentary, and it's like this where people tag walls, drawn walls, and repainted surfaces that all the the owners of the actual buildings and how each layer. So I was wondering what you guys thought about all that, along with all the street elements.
Rosenquist is a good call.
Visual dialogue and chatter, as well as things like James Rosenquist, how he took his commercial art and turned it into.
A good call, and also the work he influenced David and Jeff Koons to do.
Yeah.
But they didn't him, and you got farther away from him than they did.
Yeah.
So
definitely Rosenquist. we just happened to be in Cologne. We went to the Ludwig Museum, and they had a Rosenquist whole show of his work, and that was kind of it somehow it gave me the okay to go really big. Like after looking at his work, I thought, well, okay, if he can make these monster pieces, the visual kind of chaotic business that I'm working on, it works better on a larger scale. Like I like having this giant kind of chaotic mass of swirling images. And some of the pieces inside the painting, you can pick out, well, maybe this kind of looks like that. Your mind kind of runs through it looking for recognizable shapes.
Well, I noticed downstairs that the bigger the piece, the more sense of depth there is, and the more enveloped you can feel yourself. The large work along the concrete wall, the west wall. No, wait. Yes. The west wall. You just kind of fall into it, and you fall back out of it, and you fall back into it, as if you're standing out the ocean, and it comes neck deep.
Really far back, and you can't get back far enough to get out of the frame. So you're kind of brought into the picture, and you're basically just swimming around in the photo and the image for a while if you want to.
That's one thing that connects to Rothko, because somebody asked him, how far should you stand on one of the paintings? He said 10 inches.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and his other quote was, how long does it take you to paint a painting? And he said 30 years. So it was like, well, yeah, it's true. Another question, sure.
Yes, you have a very specific color palette, which I really like a lot.
Thank you.
It's these pinks and purples, which seem, I don't know. Can you talk a little bit where
Sure.
you get those colors? They remind me. First of all, probably not true, but they seem like girls' colors.
Well, pink is punk,
I love this.
I grew up in the 80s, so pink was a really big popular color. I think I had a pair of Chuck Taylors that were a hot pink for a while. So
Actually, it looks kind of like, is it 80s or is it 50s?
it's probably a little bit of everything.
Yeah, because Elvis used to love pink and
There you go. It's
Also, the pink blue designations are relatively recent.
yeah.
In fact, I think at the court of Louis XIV, it was exactly the opposite.
It was. Pink was a boy's color, and blue was a girl's color.
Yeah. I think there are different shades of both pink and blue, but pink was considered the masculine color, and blue the feminine.
I think for me, color has always. I actually tried to be a moody artist for a while. I tried to paint all darks, and as soon as I paint something all dark, a piece of pink pops in. I can't. It's just who I am. It's part of my personality. I love car culture. That's another thing I'm addicted to. Hot rods and street cars and those really, even the LA-based painters who use a lot of car paints. Those really candy colors, highly. So yeah, it's a piece of who I am. It's definitely part of my personality.
Is that one of the reasons you moved here?
I moved here, and there's another. Okay, so I moved to New Jersey from the magazine article,
Right.
And when I was in New Jersey, and I just quit the school, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I found another magazine article. It was a Transworld Skate magazine, and it was a company called Pal Peralta, and they had a one-page ad that said "Artists Wanted," and I was completely broke. I lived in a boarding house, and I had like 4 color copies of art.
Boarding house in Dover, New Jersey.
Yeah. Right off La Oficina de Abogado, and it was a tiny little room, and all the students had this little shared area where we had a communal kitchen and a funky bathroom. So I ended up getting a job and moving to Santa Barbara. Did skateboard graphics for PAL for 7 years, which was awesome because that was one of the things as a kid I was really into. The world's worst skater, but I loved the idea of it. So, yeah.
And surfing too.
Yeah, I was even worse at surfing, but I loved it. So, really good at crashing. So I figured I'd stick the art. I was the kid that drew the tattoos, like
It's important to know that you can do.
I've been friends with lots of groups of people, but I've never been associated with only one. And I hope, now it's all reflected in this. You can see bits and pieces of all of it wrapped up into this work. Yeah.
It's a highly synthesized type of work. Many things coming in from many sources.
It's every artist has their own way of approaching things, but I never had like one thing I wanted to say. I never had one like direct feed on what I was thinking. I always had a million things running in my brain at one time. And when I finally realized that million things running in my brain at one time is what I needed to focus on, that allowed all of this work to happen. And it's still evolving. Every piece is pushing one way or another, but I wanted an open-end kind of process that could evolve, something that's going to go in some other direction.
At least use an elbow room.
Yeah. I like, there's so many artists that I like, and there are different ways of doing things where some people, they get really good at doing one thing and they repeat it in its own kind of context over and over again. And I could never do that. I'd do one or two paintings a certain way, and then I was just going off in another direction. So,
well, they're trying to focus because they need to brand themselves.
Yeah.
And what you've done is brand yourself by not doing that.
Yeah, unbranded branding. Yeah, that's the psychology behind it is crazy. Steve.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just curious. In the beginning, you said that he asks very direct questions and gives you very direct answers. So I'm wondering if you could just be more specific about that. What do you think those questions he's asking, and what do you think those answers are?
Well, I'll let him tell you what the answers are.
Okay.
The questions are, is this is this a blend of fine and street art, or is it or are they one and the same? And well, the answer is yes. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
This bifurcated identity doesn't really exist beyond a certain level. It's just beyond where we see these things originally. And for instance, what motivates his color choices, as he just told you. It's a combination of personal taste and commercial experience.
There's there, and I try to figure out in my own mind how I'm going to explain all of this, and it's interesting. Like on one way, this aspect, you'll see these paintings up here, but then downstairs I have these little street people that I make, these little wooden figures. Oh, yeah. And that was another offshoot of a thought I had with graffiti. People are, when graffiti is raw and it's real and it's people running through train yards and they're throwing up whatever they do and they do it fast. And then there's the idea of graffiti where people are, it's mural, basically in my mind, I call it mural art, hired, or they're, allowed to do work on a big wall, and you have the guys that the real graffiti is where you're doing it illegally. You don't have permission to do it, where muralists are kind of, they're hired or they get permission to do things. And my street people, I was trying to find a way to take what I do in the studio and bring it out on the street, but in my own way. They're my little mobile murals, and it was just one of these ideas in my head. Like, I'm going to put this out there. I'm going to take photos of it. And then the photos become a piece of art, and the little people become, my imaginary friends, I guess, and see what happens. The reaction was pretty interesting. When you take art out on the street, people, when they first see you, they get very defensive. They think you're going to, paint their walls, or you're going to screw up their storefronts or something. But once they see what you're doing, they get really inquisitive, and then they ask questions, and it's kind of like you're disarming this illegal kind of whatever you would want to call it, a stereotypical like damaging sort of art form.
Right.
And
Well, understandably, as for landowners,
yeah,
shoppers, where the wind up is more important than what it is.
Yeah.
But property by their own choice.
and that's what I love about, I'll say this real quick, what I loved about the idea of graffiti and tagging and living in downtown LA, we have, covered, and you end up in this, what Sandy said, this archaeological process where so somebody will come and they'll throw up a tag on a wall, and then the property owner will paint the wall, but it's always the slightly wrong color, so you'll see these kind of Rothko squares everywhere where someone carefully kind of tried to grid it out in a little square, but it's not the same color. And to somebody doing tags or throwing up graffiti, they'll see that and they know somebody's already been there. So it's almost like a green light to come and do it again. And somebody else will come and go over that. And then the owner will paint another color. And eventually the owner runs out of that original color and they'll do a completely different. And if you see this after like 20 years, it's this really cool kind of hodgepodge mix of elements of what was painted and other things. And other graffiti guys will go over top of original other work. So to me, it's beautiful. I love the whole idea of that kind of collage of human experience.
Layering on layering.
Yeah.
As things show through.
And that's kind of what I do in some of these. So yeah, that's another part of it too. So the question.
Is it not necessarily a question, but just commentary on it? It's kind of makes me think of like a social history going on the wall.
Definitely.
You're incorporating it in the work. You're carrying on this history, passing it along, just like we copy some of the imagery that we find from archaeological digs. You find them popping up in other people's artwork. We're just
Definitely.
continuing the history and adding it our layer to it.
Sure. Look at Picasso. I mean, his Demenzel, the African, the masks, the African mask. I mean, that came from somewhere. It all comes. Everything comes from one thing. I had an art teacher said that everything's been done.
Yep.
How you do it next, or how you change it. It's all been done. So how it's your experience. It's mirror of history. You're gonna what you're doing now. If it survives 100 years, people can see what you were doing, and the fact that it was created in that way at that time, it tells you what was going on. So,
Kind of like your nothing is new under the sun, but your particular selection of those things from the past and the arrangement of with the personality of yourself in it is what makes it unique.
sure.
Nothing is new, and it's always new in the presentation. It's because we're always discovering new things in the old, and as a result, old things in the new. Yes.
I thought there was a difference between tagging and graffiti. And as
Sure.
I understood it, tagging is when you wrote your name. And in the 80s in New York, where I lived, every surface was tagged and you just saw everything covered. And even now, you'll go to the ATM machine and someone's carved their initials on the thing so you can't read it.
That's a long,
At
yeah.
the gas station too, you can't read it. Or when they do it on the stop sign or the directions.
It is. And that's another thing. Like, I'm not an expert in graffiti by any means, but it's one of those little things that I know a little bit about. But it is true. It's one of those, like, it's a form of expression, although sometimes, it's annoying or misguided.
I always thought it was a way, it's a way for those people to say, I am here, I exist.
Yeah.
I want you to notice this. This is the only avenue I have to let you know that I am in this world, and I'm going to repeat this as often as I can. And it's like a
There's
kind of
volumes about
desperate
that.
measure.
Yeah, that's how modern graffiti started.
Yeah.
Modern.
In New York and Philadelphia in the late '60s, where it just and quickly the name tag took on kind of a personalized design. The earliest one was cornbread in Philadelphia in 1967. Undistinguished handwriting, but it was always the same, so it became recognized. And the next one was Julio 204 in New York. I remember seeing his tag with what we call the Puerto Rican J. It looked like a backwards L with a loop. And that was in the summer of '68. And then with Taki 183, it blew over.
Yeah.
I think that was winter of '69.
I think what I get from this is, there's a career trying to push my way through to get to a certain level. You have this being accepted and not being accepted. And sometimes when people feel like they don't have a voice, this is an avenue to vent or to express. And I like some of the energy that you get off of that. Like the guys I've met, they're doing their thing, and maybe they don't always have like a long drawn out understanding of the history of it, but they know this is a form of expression and it's not accepted. And there's an energy to it. I really like that because some really great skill comes out of it, pops out of that. And then you get some really like genius people that can do amazing things. And it always felt like it wasn't accepted. But then you look at the gallery world and the museum world, and that's a barrier that you couldn't cross.
It's a
Sure.
tradition.
And I think there's something very human about it, because if you've ever seen that film Cave of Forgotten Dreams about Lasso Caves, and you realize over many years, even early human culture, they went in these caves over many years. And you can also compare it to kind of subway stations and people going there, and there's a constant dialogue. But I'd say it tells me something that humans from the very beginning, there's a creativity and there's a need to express yourself.
You make
And
your
there's
mark.
always a need to
Make your mark, literally.
make your mark, and you're in dialogue with even people you might not cross paths with, but always there within humans.
I think they found Roman walls that made fun of different,
Sexual or scandal.
yeah. So everybody had commentary.
Exactly. Yes.
Two things. There is distinction between gang tagging, which marks territory and has coded communication.
Sure, yeah, of course.
And,
Yeah.
and the lone artist who gets out there and does like their street art thing. So I see a difference there.
That's
And the gang units in the police department, they know how to decode that. So they know when somebody's threatening somebody.
I grew up in the country. Yeah, I was like a gang of one.
I live in Santa Barbara, so so my question, beyond that, I know there's that element, and I think that was part of your question. I would like for you to touch on your coffee art.
Oh yeah, coffee drawings.
Yes, please.
That's another. The way I came to what I do, I guess, daily practice is a big part of the format. I love to draw. I love to make art. I would do this, if nobody ever came to see anything, I would still do it. I love it. I can't not do it. And so basically any town I've ever lived in, I've found a way to find a coffee shop or a diner and sit down and just draw. In New Jersey at the comic book school, we stayed up all night and went to the Dover Star Diner and drew on placemats. If there's a pencil and there's free time, I'm drawing on something. So I ended up meeting my friend Gronk, who's another well-known artist, and he and I would meet up for coffee in the morning, and there's two artists sitting around drinking coffee. Something's going to get drawn on, and we started a practice of just daily watercolor sketches. It's a little kit that I carry around, and it's got the cheap drugstore watercolor kit. Now I have a really nice watercolor kit, but spend an hour and a half. You sit down, and it's almost like muscle memory. You just let it go, and I work with these ideas of identity. Who is my identity? So I think a lot about the mask you put on before you go to work, not in a negative way, but everyone has their own notion of who they are. So when you wake up and you go out on the street, you're wearing your little mask, and that's fine. There's always something that you don't want people to see. It's something that's personal that you're just not going to throw it out there. So I started drawing these little masks, and there's thousands of drawings over the years. You know, it's a huge collection of plates downstairs that have the more finished pieces. I like everyone knows something about masks. You can be whoever you want when you put this mask on, and it's like branding. You know, it's another branding aspect. Yeah, who do I want you to think I am versus, you know, what I'm going to do when you guys are gone. They're not always the same. So, you know.
How much Aboriginal art have you looked at?
Oh, I grew up with National Geographic. So, I mean, I was glued to that thing. We got National Geographic, Reader's Digest. And Reader's Digest always told you this scary story of somebody almost died. And then National Geographic, it was just photographs from around the world. And yeah, that was my Google internet search for me.
When you say Aboriginal, are you talking about general indigenous peoples? Or
Because
specifically?
the mask aspect
Oh, okay.
is huge,
Yeah,
like what you would see in the Fowler.
it's all these things creep in. I used to hate it when artists talked about what they did when they were kids, but you look back on it and like, yeah, a lot of things you did when you're young really do affect how you act later on in life. I was a Star Wars nerd, you know, I grew up with but that was the first time anyone had ever seen things like that. So I was front and center for all this technology developing. I was hooked, you know. My college had the first Apple computer, and that was the first time we ever messed around with digital anything. But I learned how to do all my screen printing techniques through stat cameras and diffusion transfer machines and cutting Rubylith. It was a lot of work, but then this little computer came along, and a whole generation of people who worked in printing shops, their careers were gone overnight. It was just click and send, you know? So, well, long story short, I have a lot of appreciation for the things I did when I was younger. Now I'm sort of reinventing them. So that helps.
And actually, I was going to say, one of the things is you incorporate the hand cutting techniques that you learned, because you hand cut all these shapes and lines, and that's a technique you learned probably from the old days.
A lot, like, take for example, the younger generation using the computer, they have drawing tablets now where you can actually draw everything digitally and never touch a pen. I'm always going to use a brush. Like, inking with a brush to me is sacred. I love using real ink and real brush, and I've honed it down to this thing where I'm very, very specific about what I want to do. But now digital technology, that's a whole nother aspect of how it helps me with composing my abstract pieces. Now I can just layer them up in Photoshop and grind them all instead of physically going through this monstrous and do it all in this file.
The computer is just another
Just a tool.
tool for the studio.
Right. And it's
that's been understood. I mean, two of the earliest artists to make use of the computer as an artistic tool were Philip Perlstein and David Hockney.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you know they're doing straight ahead figurative stuff.
Go ahead.
So what's next?
I don't know. You know, I got hooked on the color blue. That was another thing. That's another little funny offshoot of what I do. I kept seeing downtown a lot of these homeless tents, these bright blue. They have these tarps, you know, they're electric blue. And I kept thinking I wanted to do something with this. It's like this whole section of downtown Los Angeles that they're the invisible people. But then they have these ironically, insanely bright tarps that they use for their tents. So I kept thinking of the irony there, and I started thinking about the color blue, and then I ran into Yves Klein and his whole thing with blue, and
Although it's a different blue than
very different blue. And I'm becoming, and this work is kind of a hybrid of my existence as a very specific and then getting into very conceptual art. So blue is a conceptual experiment that I'm working with. I was lucky enough to be able to show in Venice on Giudecca Island during the last Biennale there, and that was the history of blue. I mean, at one time Venice controlled the whole usage of blue, and it was more expensive than gold. It was a very, very specific thing that only very wealthy people could get their hands on. And here it is in my neighborhood covering the tents of homeless people. So these things run in my head, and I'll sit there and just, and I
Well,
get,
this is your newest work. I mean, it's hot off the
yes,
presses.
this
And
is,
it's dominated by blue.
yeah. And this is a screen print that we just made. Printing is one of the aspects of what I love to do. I love the whole layering process of actually making the prints. And we just finished this one, Modern Multiples, which has another long history in Los Angeles. As a printer, Richard Eduardo, he passed, but his nephew, Montana Mills. So we worked on this. We just did yesterday. It's hot off the press, but it's the same idea of just playing with the line art, and the color structure comes. This is all done on the computer, but it's the same idea.
Also, blue sells well in Los Angeles.
Oh yeah, well, Dodger blue is another thing. That's a big one. Then Lakers colors are pretty popular, and it's kind of a rough mix of purple and like more yellowy mustard color, but it works. I love it.
Oh, I want to just clarify. The prints, it's a screen print, so you did the design on a computer. It's done digitally.
Oh yeah, but printed by hand.
It's a serigraph, so
Sure.
each layer is hand done. There's 5 layers.
It's
They're all very.
It's a labor-intensive process, but if you ever get a chance to see how it works, it's pretty cool. Go ahead.
Is Montana maintaining the studio where Richard had been?
Yeah, they're holding it together. Richard Eduardo has a very in Los Angeles. He worked with everyone, and he passed a couple years ago, and his nephew came and took over the shop. So they have an amazing history. They have all the tools. It's so cool to actually see all these people come through and their work that they've done over the years. A lot of street art, a lot of fine art. It's one of those like hybrid mix opportunities to get to play around with, and it's accessible. It's in the form of printmaking. It's probably one of the more affordable things you can do compared to lithography or etching or things like that. So,
How many are in the edition?
this one came out to a whopping 12. So yeah, and I love the idea of limited edition. Digital printing is another aspect today where artists can, make digital prints. And I don't like to use the word G-clay, but it's what they call them. But with these, you're going to get 12. There's only going to be 12, and there's never going to be 12 more, question.
It's still expensive to make the prints.
Yeah.
How do you fund your
Well, commercial work sometimes.
You fund it yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting experience funding an art career.
We were lucky enough to get a little bit of a grant.
Orange County Collector Group, yes.
Also introduced.
I did get a grant from thanks to Peter. Peter recommended me for a grant opportunity, which came through the COVID thing, shut everything down, which was 2 years of very frustrating as an artist. You're kind of trapped in it's some time to paint, but at the same time, I met this great group, the Orange County Collector Group, and they gave me a grant, a fellowship. So I mean, it's hand to mouth,
Oh, yeah, I know.
you do until you don't.
We all know, yeah.
I had an opportunity down the road. I could have, like so many other friends of mine who went through art school, we took a different path. I had the chance to become an art director for a company, in Portland, and I chose not to do it years ago because I wanted to do this. I think in some way you have to do what you have to do, and it's going to go the way it's going to go. Sometimes you're always beating your head up against the wall about what do you want to do or how do you want to do it. God forbid somebody the idea of what are people going to think. You always have, but there's a harmony in it. So, yeah. Question.
Yeah, you said you hit the word G-clay. Why?
I don't hate the word G-clay. It's kind of like when digital printing came about, I didn't understand it because I was thinking lithography and intaglio, and then this word popped up, and it's a French word for squirt, I think, basically. It's a word you had to give it to make it sound really good. I don't know, but it's an affordable way for artists to make prints. So I actually like making the prints.
So you'd
But-
rather say high class inkjet printing? than-
Yeah, call it what it is. This is silkscreen, and
The fact that it's in French indicates the high class.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
it's like
Freedom for us.
I think sometimes vocabulary is a funny thing. How you talk about certain aspects, and that's a perfect example. What are you going to call it? I'm going to call it an inkjet printing. It's like they used to call things used cars. They don't call used cars anymore. Now they're previously owned.
Pre-owned,
Like that's different.
broken in.
Exactly.
Like, totally from the dealership. There were plenty of used car lots. They still let-
Well, yeah, a lot of them have changed, but then again, it's an opportunity. Anytime you define something as being a high class or not high class, there's an opportunity for an artist to go in there and screw that up too, and change it around, augment digital printing, and do something completely different. So I never say never. Don't say don't do or don't support. I think all of this is like NFTs. I'm still trying to figure that out. That's a whole nother universe of digital. What the hell's going on? I don't know, but I'm learning. So yeah, you never end up teaching yourself if you can.
Like to make at least a thought observation. You have, as you say, what goes into your work is multi-layered, comes from a variety of different things, and what moves you at the moment. But the end result, the presentation in a show, has a connection. It has a universal theme. So it's not like, oh, well, today I'm doing this, tomorrow I'm doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things that don't get in the show, but yeah, definitely. When I step back and look at it, I wanted a cohesive body of work, something that you could say, no matter how I evolve the process, I do want to create a larger body that people can trace the evolution. That's important to me. If I feel like I've taken too big of a leap in any one direction, sometimes I'll hesitate, or I'll have to spend more time in the transition. I think that's important. You look at anyone throughout history. My first art college experience in writing a paper, I did something on some seriously abstract piece of work, and I didn't appreciate conceptual art when I was younger because I was young. I didn't realize how long a lifetime was. Lifetimes can be pretty damn long. When your evolution from point A to Z. Now I love that kind of stuff. Like I said, I think in the article, like Cy Twombly was the one that broke my brain on conceptual art. Like if I had looked at one of his pieces when I was a young kid and I only understood like physical techniques, I couldn't understand them, But now when you look back and you go, oh, this guy spent his entire life developing this. That is where I am now. I'm becoming more conceptual because I can appreciate this evolution, if that helps. Yeah. So that's part of it. And it's like skateboarding, it's car art, it's, we have Google, so we can Google search anyone. I can look up all the skateboard people that I know in that group, and I can just, I can do skateboard decks, or I can turn around and paint a car hood, or, anything goes. It's a million possibilities all wrapped up in, whatever fits in the gallery. So sculpture is the next thing, as soon as I can find a space big enough to hold it. Any other questions?
Great.
All right. Well, thanks for coming out. I appreciate it.